Sam Bankman-Fried stole $8 billion, not through a hack, not through a single fraudulent transaction, not even through traditional embezzlement. He built an entire cryptocurrency exchange, FTX, that processed billions in daily trading volume, attracted investments from the world's most sophisticated venture capitalists, and became the second largest crypto platform on Earth. Then, he systematically looted customer deposits to fund his hedge fund, buy luxury real estate, make political donations, and gamble on increasingly desperate trades. The scale is almost incomprehensible. $8 billion is more than the GDP of 80 countries. It's more than the annual revenue of companies like Spotify, Reddit, or Airbnb. It's roughly equal to the net worth of the world's 200th richest person, and Bankman-Fried made it disappear in less than 3 years. What nobody understood until it was too late was that FTX wasn't really a cryptocurrency exchange. It was a front. Behind the slick marketing, the celebrity endorsements featuring Tom Brady and Steph Curry, and the $135 million spent on naming rights to the Miami Heat arena, FTX was running the oldest scam in finance, using new customer deposits to cover losses from bad bets. A Ponzi scheme dressed up in blockchain technology and effective altruism philosophy. Bankman-Fried appeared on magazine covers. He testified before Congress. He rubbed shoulders with Bill Clinton and Tony Blair at conferences. He pledged to give away his entire fortune to charitable causes. Financial media called him the J.P. Morgan of crypto, the respectable face of a disreputable industry. But what journalists, investors, and customers didn't know was that from almost the very beginning, FTX customer funds were flowing directly into Alameda Research, Bankman-Fried's trading firm. Billions in deposits that customers thought were safely held were actually backing risky trades, covering losses, and funding a lifestyle of penthouse apartments and private jets. This is the story of how a math prodigy from MIT built a $32 billion empire in 3 years, then destroyed it in 3 days. How he convinced brilliant investors to hand him billions while running what prosecutors would call one of the largest frauds in American history. How he stole $8 billion and almost got away with it, and how it all came crashing down in spectacular, devastating fashion. On November 11, 2022, Sam Bankman-Fried filed for bankruptcy protection for FTX, Alameda Research, and over 130 affiliated entities. Within hours, John J. Ray III, the attorney who'd cleaned up Enron's bankruptcy, was appointed CEO. His first filing with the court contained a statement that would become infamous. "Never in my career have I seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information." This from a man who'd spent years untangling Enron's deliberately complex fraud. Just 10 days earlier, FTX had been valued at $32 billion. Bankman-Fried had a personal net worth estimated at $26 billion, making him one of the richest people under 30 on Earth. FTX processed $10 to $15 billion in daily trading volume. The company had been profitable, generating roughly $1 billion in revenue in 2021. The gap between apparent success and complete collapse seemed impossible to bridge. How does a $32 billion company implode in 10 days? How does a billionaire lose everything before his 31st birthday? How does an exchange trusted with billions in customer assets turn out to have almost nothing in reserve? The answer was that FTX never actually was what it appeared to be. Sam Bankman-Fried, universally known as SBF in crypto circles, cultivated an image as the responsible adult in cryptocurrency's chaotic playground. While other crypto founders posted memes and talked about decentralization, SBF wore cargo shorts and t-shirts to congressional hearings and talked about regulatory compliance. While competitors operated from legal gray zones, FTX positioned itself as the exchange regulators could trust. He was brilliant by any measure. MIT physics graduate, Jane Street Capital alum where he'd traded international ETFs, utilitarian philosopher who claimed he was only getting rich to give it all away through effective altruism, the movement that uses data and reason to maximize charitable impact. The effective altruism angle was particularly effective for reputation building. SBF publicly committed to donating his entire fortune, keeping only enough for a modest lifestyle. He lived with roommates in the Bahamas. He drove a Toyota Corolla despite being worth billions. He slept on a beanbag in his office. The ascetic billionaire archetype resonated with people tired of crypto's ostentatious wealth displays. Behind this carefully constructed image was a different reality. SBF was gambling with customer money on a massive scale. He'd built FTX and Alameda Research as essentially the same entity, with customer deposits freely flowing between them, despite public claims they were separate companies. When Alameda's trading positions went bad, FTX customer funds covered the losses. It was a house of cards held together by one thing: continuous growth. As long as new customer deposits exceeded Alameda's losses, the scheme could continue. FTX's rapid expansion from $0 to $32 billion valuation in 3 years generated enough new capital to cover the bleeding from Alameda's increasingly desperate trades. But in 2022, the crypto market collapsed. Bitcoin dropped from $69,000 in November 2021 to below $20,000 by June 2022. The entire crypto ecosystem lost over $2 trillion in market value. FTX's trading volumes declined, new customer deposits slowed, and Alameda's losses, previously hidden by growth, became impossible to cover. What most people don't know is that the fraud wasn't discovered through regulatory oversight, customer complaints, or whistleblowers. It was exposed by a rival, Binance CEO Changpeng Zhao, known as CZ, who tweeted that Binance would be selling their holdings of FTT, the cryptocurrency token that FTX had created, and that served as collateral for much of Alameda's borrowing. That single tweet triggered a bank run. Within 72 hours, customers tried to withdraw $5 billion from FTX. The exchange couldn't meet redemptions. Why? Because the money wasn't there. It was in Alameda's accounts, backing failed trades or invested in illiquid assets. FTX's balance sheet, when finally examined, showed an $8 billion hole where customer deposits should have been. Behind the slick marketing and the effective altruism philosophy was something much older and simpler: theft. SBF had taken customer money and gambled it. When the bets went bad, he took more customer money to cover losses. When those bets also failed, he took even more. A classic fraud spiral that always ends the same way: catastrophic collapse when new deposits can no longer cover old losses. Let me take you back to the beginning, to 2017, when a nerdy MIT graduate started a crypto trading firm in Berkeley with a few $1 million borrowed from friends and family. To the early days when Alameda Research was making millions on simple arbitrage trades that seemed almost too easy. To the moment when SBF decided to build his own exchange to facilitate his trading operations. And to the gradual, then sudden transformation from legitimate trading operation to massive fraud. The decisions, small at first, to use customer funds for just a short period to cover temporary liquidity needs. The rationalization that it was fine because the money would be paid back. The escalating desperation as losses mounted, and the only solution seemed to be bigger, riskier bets. This is how Sam Bankman-Fried stole $8 billion, not in a single moment of criminal decision-making, but through a series of choices that started small and snowballed into one of the largest frauds in financial history. It's a story about brilliant intelligence applied to criminal ends, about how reputational management can disguise fraud for years, about how the lack of regulation in cryptocurrency markets enabled theft that would have been impossible in traditional finance, and about how every fraud, no matter how sophisticated, eventually collapses under its own weight. Chapter 1. Math Genius. Sam Bankman-Fried was born in 1992 on the Stanford University campus, where both his parents taught law. Barbara Fried and Joseph Bankman were prominent legal scholars, Barbara specializing in tax law and philosophy, Joseph in tax policy and behavioral economics. They raised Sam and his younger brother in a household where intellectual rigor was the baseline expectation. Dinner table conversations revolved around philosophy, ethics, and abstract reasoning. Sam showed exceptional mathematical ability early. He attended Crystal Springs Upland School, an elite private school in the Bay Area, where he dominated math competitions. Teachers described him as intensely focused when interested in a problem, but completely disengaged from subjects that didn't capture his attention. He was, by multiple accounts, socially awkward, not in a charming, quirky way, but in a way that made normal conversation difficult. He spoke in rapid bursts about topics he cared about, math, philosophy, video games, and seemed almost annoyed when forced to engage in small talk. Friends from this period remember someone brilliant, but difficult to connect with emotionally. In 2010, Bankman-Fried enrolled at MIT to study physics. He'd considered several elite universities, but chose MIT because of its quantitative rigor and concentration of similarly minded students. At MIT, he could be surrounded by people who understood complex mathematical concepts as fluently as he did. During his sophomore year, SBF encountered effective altruism, the philosophical movement that would become central to his public identity. The basic premise resonated with his utilitarian worldview: use evidence and reason to determine how to do the most good possible. Don't just donate to charities that feel good. Calculate which interventions save the most lives or prevent the most suffering per dollar spent. Effective altruism had a particular answer for talented individuals: earning to give. Rather than working directly for non-profits, you should maximize your earning potential in high-paying careers, then donate the vast majority of your income to the most effective charities. A talented MIT graduate could make far more money in finance or tech than in non-profit work, and those earnings, if donated strategically, could fund dozens of non-profit workers. This philosophy provided moral justification for pursuing wealth. SBF wasn't being greedy by chasing money. He was maximizing his positive impact on the world. The more he earned, the more he could donate. Wealth became a moral imperative rather than a selfish pursuit. In 2014, he graduated from MIT and faced the classic dilemma: what career path would maximize earning potential? Investment banking paid well, but involved brutal hours and limited upside. Technology startups offered equity but required years to pay off. Management consulting was stable but capped earnings. SBF chose quantitative trading. Specifically, he accepted a position at Jane Street Capital, one of the most prestigious proprietary trading firms in the world. Jane Street employed MIT physics graduates and similar quantitative minds to trade securities using mathematical models and algorithms. The work was intellectually demanding, the pay was excellent, and successful traders could earn millions annually. At Jane Street, SBF worked on international ETF arbitrage, identifying price discrepancies between exchange-traded funds in different markets and exploiting them for profit. The strategies required sophisticated understanding of correlations, transaction costs, and execution timing. SBF was reportedly good at it, though not exceptional by Jane Street's elite standards. He spent 3 years at Jane Street, from 2014 to 2017. During this period, he absorbed lessons about market microstructure, liquidity provision, and arbitrage mechanics that would prove crucial for his later ventures. He also saved aggressively, living cheaply, donating a substantial portion of his income to effective altruism charities, and banking capital for future opportunities. By 2017, SBF had accumulated roughly $1 million in personal savings and was looking for higher upside opportunities. Jane Street offered stable 7-figure annual income, but the upside was capped. Partners at the firm made tens of millions, but reaching that level required decades of sustained performance. SBF wanted faster wealth accumulation to maximize his charitable impact. Around this time, he started noticing something strange in cryptocurrency markets. Bitcoin prices varied dramatically across different exchanges, sometimes 20–30% price differentials between US exchanges like Coinbase and Asian exchanges like those in South Korea or Japan. These were not small discrepancies that disappeared instantly. They persisted for hours or even days because moving money between countries and converting between fiat currencies was slow and difficult. For someone trained in arbitrage at Jane Street, these price gaps looked like free money. Buy Bitcoin on Coinbase at $10,000. Immediately sell on a Korean exchange for $13,000. Pocket the $3,000 spread, minus transaction costs and currency conversion fees. Repeat millions of times. This opportunity was too large to ignore. In mid-2017, SBF left Jane Street to pursue crypto arbitrage full-time. He partnered with Tara McAuley, who'd worked in effective altruism circles and had some experience with cryptocurrency. Together, they founded Alameda Research, named after the county in California where SBF had grown up. The initial capital came from friends, family, and effective altruism connections. SBF raised roughly $50 to $100 million from a network of people who knew him through MIT, Jane Street, or the EA community. The pitch was straightforward. Crypto arbitrage offered exceptional risk-adjusted returns with limited downside. As long as price differentials existed and they could execute trades efficiently, profits were nearly guaranteed. The early months validated this thesis spectacularly. Alameda was reportedly making millions per week on simple arbitrage. The crypto market in 2017 was inefficient beyond anything SBF had seen in traditional finance. Price gaps that would disappear in milliseconds in equity markets persisted for hours in crypto. Transaction costs were low. Competition was limited because most institutional traders hadn't yet entered crypto. You see, the crypto arbitrage trade seemed almost too good to be true. And like many things that seemed too good to be true, it contained hidden problems that would eventually prove catastrophic. The first problem was operational complexity. Moving money between countries, converting between cryptocurrencies and fiat currencies, managing exchange accounts across dozens of platforms, all of this required infrastructure that Alameda initially lacked. They had to build systems rapidly while executing trades worth millions daily. The second problem was counterparty risk. Crypto exchanges were largely unregulated. Some were legitimate businesses, others were semi-scams. Several major exchanges from this era later collapsed or were revealed as fraudulent. Alameda had money spread across platforms that could disappear overnight with no recourse. The third problem was that the easy arbitrage trades attracted competition. As more sophisticated traders entered crypto markets in 2018 and 2019, the obvious price differentials narrowed. The strategy that generated millions in 2017 became less profitable. Alameda needed to evolve beyond simple arbitrage into more complex trading strategies. This evolution pushed Alameda from low-risk arbitrage into higher-risk directional trading. Instead of just exploiting price differences, they started taking positions on whether Bitcoin would rise or fall. They traded altcoins, alternative cryptocurrencies with smaller market caps and higher volatility. They used leverage, borrowing money to amplify returns. These strategies were more profitable in good markets, but also much riskier. A leveraged long position in Bitcoin during a bull market could generate massive returns. The same position in a bear market could generate massive losses. By late 2018, Alameda was managing hundreds of millions in trading capital. They'd become one of the largest crypto trading firms, executing massive volumes across dozens of exchanges. But they'd also moved far beyond the safe arbitrage trades that launched the company. They were now taking substantial directional risk, using leverage, and operating in markets known for extreme volatility. SBF was reportedly sleeping 4 hours per night, managing trading operations from a house in Berkeley that doubled as Alameda's office. The company was growing rapidly but chaotically, hiring new traders, expanding to new markets, building internal systems on the fly. There were no formal controls, limited oversight, and essentially no separation between company funds and SBF's personal judgment about what trades to make. This operational chaos would prove crucial to what happened next, because in 2019, SBF decided that Alameda needed something most trading firms don't build: their own exchange. The reasoning made sense on the surface. Alameda paid enormous fees to exchanges where they traded. Those fees were revenue for the exchanges. If Alameda owned an exchange, they could capture that revenue themselves, while also gaining operational advantages: faster execution, lower costs, better access to liquidity. So in 2019, Sam Bankman-Fried founded FTX. The name stood for Futures Exchange, a reference to their initial focus on cryptocurrency derivatives trading. The plan was to build a sophisticated platform that would attract professional traders with advanced features, low fees, and reliable execution. But from the very beginning, FTX and Alameda were intertwined in ways that would prove catastrophic. They shared office space. They shared employees. Chapter 2. Arbitrage Gold. The kimchi premium made Sam Bankman-Fried his first millions in crypto. In 2017, Bitcoin traded at substantial premiums on South Korean exchanges compared to US platforms. The gap sometimes reached 30 to 40%, meaning you could buy Bitcoin on Coinbase for $10,000 and simultaneously sell it on a Korean exchange for $13,000 or even $14,000. This price differential was called the kimchi premium, a somewhat derogatory term referencing Korean cuisine. The premium existed because of capital controls. South Korea restricted how much money citizens could move out of the country. This made it difficult for Korean investors to buy Bitcoin on cheaper foreign exchanges, creating persistent demand that drove up local prices. Arbitrageurs could exploit this gap, but they had to navigate complex regulatory restrictions on moving capital. SBF figured out how to navigate these restrictions more efficiently than competitors. The exact mechanics were complex, involving shell companies, multiple bank accounts, cryptocurrency transfers, and coordination with Korean counterparties. But the basic strategy was simple. Buy crypto cheap in the US, sell it expensive in Korea, convert Korean won back to dollars through various channels, and repeat. Alameda Research was reportedly making $10,025 million monthly on this single trade alone in late 2017 and early 2018. The profit margins were extraordinary, far better than anything SBF had seen trading ETFs at Jane Street, and the strategy seemed infinitely scalable. The more capital Alameda deployed, the more money they made, at least until they moved enough volume to start closing the price gap themselves. But the kimchi premium was just one arbitrage among dozens. Crypto markets in 2017-2018 were systematically inefficient in ways that shocked anyone coming from traditional finance. Price gaps existed not just between countries, but between exchanges in the same country, between different trading pairs for the same asset, and between spot markets and derivatives markets. Consider a simple example. Bitcoin might trade at $10,000 on Coinbase, but $10,200 on Kraken, both US-based exchanges. In traditional equities, such a gap would disappear in milliseconds as algorithmic traders arbitraged it away. In crypto, the gap could persist for minutes or even hours because moving Bitcoin between exchanges took time, exchange APIs were unreliable, and many exchanges had withdrawal limits or processing delays. Alameda built infrastructure to exploit these inefficiencies systematically. They maintained accounts with dozens of exchanges worldwide. They held inventory of various cryptocurrencies on each platform to enable rapid execution. They developed trading algorithms that monitored price differences across exchanges continuously and executed trades automatically when profitable opportunities appeared. The scale ramped up fast. By mid-2018, Alameda was executing billions in monthly trading volume. They'd raised additional capital from investors impressed by the returns, reportedly achieving 50 to 100% annualized profits in the early period. They expanded their team from just SBF and a handful of others to roughly 15-20 traders and developers. But here's what's interesting about this period. Alameda's success was built on market dysfunction. The arbitrage opportunities existed precisely because crypto markets were immature, inefficient, and poorly regulated. As markets matured, these opportunities would inevitably shrink. The business model had an expiration date. SBF understood this. He knew the easy money wouldn't last forever. As more sophisticated traders entered crypto, as exchanges improved their technology, and as liquidity increased, the obvious arbitrage trades would disappear. Alameda needed to evolve beyond arbitrage into more complex, higher-margin strategies. This pushed them into market making, providing liquidity by simultaneously posting buy and sell orders on exchanges, capturing the bid-ask spread. Market makers serve an important function. They ensure that traders can buy or sell assets quickly without moving prices dramatically. In exchange for providing this service, market makers profit from the spread between buy and sell prices. Alameda became one of the largest crypto market makers globally by 2018, making markets in hundreds of different cryptocurrency pairs across dozens of exchanges. They'd post buy orders at slightly below market price and sell orders at slightly above, pocketing the difference when both sides traded. Do this thousands of times per day across hundreds of trading pairs, and the profits accumulate to millions monthly. But market making is more complex than pure arbitrage. You're holding inventory that fluctuates in value. If you're making markets in Bitcoin and the price drops rapidly, you lose money on your Bitcoin inventory even while earning spreads. Managing this inventory risk requires sophisticated hedging strategies using derivatives markets, futures, options, perpetual swaps. Alameda expanded into crypto derivatives aggressively. They traded Bitcoin futures on platforms like BitMEX, the dominant derivatives exchange at the time. They used leverage, sometimes 20x or even 50x, to amplify returns, and they took increasingly large directional positions, betting not just on spreads, but on whether prices would rise or fall. This was where the strategy started drifting from low-risk arbitrage toward higher-risk speculation. The line between market making and proprietary trading blurred. Alameda wasn't just facilitating trades and earning spreads, they were taking substantial positions based on SBF's views about market direction. And SBF, despite his brilliance, was not infallible at predicting crypto prices. Nobody is. The market is too chaotic, driven by sentiment and speculation rather than fundamental valuation. Alameda started experiencing significant losses on certain trades in 2018 and early 2019. These losses were manageable at first. The arbitrage and market-making operations generated enough profit to cover bad directional bets, but they established a dangerous pattern, using steady arbitrage profits to subsidize increasingly risky speculation. Look, the other issue was operational. Alameda was growing too fast to build proper systems. They had money spread across 80+ exchange accounts globally. They had complex positions in hundreds of cryptocurrencies and derivatives. They had multiple corporate entities in different jurisdictions for legal and tax reasons. And they had almost no formal accounting, risk management, or compliance infrastructure. Sam Bankman-Fried was essentially running a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund using spreadsheets and gut instinct. There were no daily P&L reports, no rigorous position tracking, no systematic risk limits. Trades were executed based on SBF's judgment without formal approval processes or oversight. This cowboy operation worked during the crypto bull market of 2017-2018. When everything's going up, operational sloppiness doesn't immediately cause problems, but it created vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic when market conditions shifted. The 2018 crypto winter tested Alameda's resilience. Bitcoin crashed from $20,000 in December 2017 to $3,000 by December 2018, an 85% drawdown. The entire crypto market contracted severely. Trading volumes on exchanges declined. Arbitrage opportunities narrowed. Market-making spreads compressed as liquidity dried up. Alameda survived but took significant losses. The exact figures are unclear. The company never published audited financials, but people close to the firm have suggested losses in the hundreds of millions during this period. These losses weren't fatal because Alameda had accumulated substantial profits during the 2017 bull run, but they demonstrated that the business model was vulnerable to market conditions beyond their control. The experience should have taught caution. It should have prompted SBF to build better risk management systems, maintain larger capital reserves, and reduce leverage. Instead, it seemingly prompted the opposite conclusion. Alameda needed more capital and more control over their trading infrastructure. This is where FTX enters the story. In early 2019, SBF started planning a new cryptocurrency exchange that would serve professional traders like Alameda. The vision was to build a platform with sophisticated derivatives products, low fees, and institutional-grade reliability, something that could compete with BitMEX, then the dominant derivatives platform, but with better technology and compliance. The pitch to potential investors emphasized that owning an exchange would give Alameda strategic advantages. They'd save millions in trading fees, they'd have faster execution speeds, they'd have better access to market data, and they'd generate revenue from other traders using the platform, a diversified business model beyond just trading profits. SBF raised roughly $8 million in seed funding for FTX from crypto-focused venture investors. The initial cap table included people from the Effective Altruism Network, crypto traders who knew SBF from Alameda, and some institutional VCs beginning to explore crypto opportunities. FTX launched in May 2019, operating from headquarters in Hong Kong initially. The platform was targeted at derivatives traders, offering cryptocurrency futures, options, and perpetual swap contracts, complex instruments that most retail investors didn't understand, but that professional traders used extensively. The early product was impressive from a technical standpoint. FTX had a clean user interface, advanced order types, and novel products like tokenized stocks and leveraged tokens that didn't exist on competing exchanges. The engineering team, led by Gary Wang, SBF's MIT roommate, had built sophisticated matching engines that could handle large order volumes with minimal latency. But here's what nobody outside the inner circle knew. FTX and Alameda were not actually separate companies in any meaningful sense. They shared office space in Hong Kong and later in the Bahamas. They shared bank accounts. Gary Wang, the CTO of FTX, also wrote code for Alameda's trading systems. Caroline Ellison, who'd later become CEO of Alameda, worked on both sides. Most critically, SBF gave Alameda special privileges on FTX that no other customer had. Alameda could borrow essentially unlimited funds from FTX. They had a $65 billion line of credit, a number so absurdly large that it could only mean one thing: Alameda could access customer deposits. The fraud was baked into the code from the very beginning. When customers deposited dollars or Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency into their FTX accounts, those assets didn't just sit in segregated wallets. They flowed through a system where Alameda had backdoor access, able to borrow customer funds for trading without customers knowing or consenting. This arrangement was catastrophically illegal under virtually every jurisdiction's securities and banking laws. Customer funds at an exchange or brokerage must be segregated. They belong to customers, not to the firm, and certainly not to a related trading entity. Using customer deposits to fund proprietary trading is textbook fraud, the same violation that destroyed MF Global in 2011 and led to criminal charges against its CEO. But in crypto's unregulated Wild West, nobody was checking. FTX wasn't registered with the SEC or CFTC as an exchange or broker-dealer. They operated from jurisdictions with minimal crypto oversight. There were no regulatory audits, no capital requirements, no customer fund protections. And so the fraud began. Quietly at first, Alameda borrowing customer funds for short periods to cover temporary liquidity needs. Then more systematically, as Alameda's trading losses mounted, and they needed customer deposits to cover the shortfalls. The arbitrage gold that launched Alameda's success had transformed into something far more dangerous, a fraud spiral that would eventually steal $8 billion from customers who trusted FTX to safeguard their assets. Chapter 3: Bahamas Empire. In September 2021, Sam Bankman-Fried moved FTX's headquarters to the Bahamas, a tiny island nation with a population of 400,000 and crypto-friendly regulations. The relocation wasn't about tax advantages or operational efficiency. It was about building a physical empire that projected success, sophistication, and permanence. FTX was going to transform the Bahamas into a crypto hub, and SBF would be its architect. The company leased the entire top floors of a luxury resort in Nassau, the Albany Resort, where condos sold for tens of millions and residents included Tiger Woods. FTX's offices occupied premium space overlooking the ocean, with floor-to-ceiling windows, modern furnishings, and all the aesthetic markers of a successful tech company. But the real centerpiece was the penthouse purchases. SBF and his inner circle, including his parents, Barbara Fried and Joseph Bankman, acquired at least $300 million worth of Bahamian real estate, a $30 million penthouse for SBF himself, a $16.4 million property for his parents, multiple other luxury units for executives like Nishad Singh, Director of Engineering, and Ryan Salami, co-CEO of FTX Digital Markets. These weren't personal purchases. They were bought with company funds, FTX customer deposits flowing through convoluted corporate structures to acquire luxury real estate under executives' names. The prosecutors would later describe this as straightforward theft, taking customer money to buy personal homes. At the time, nobody outside FTX questioned it. The company was valued at $32 billion after a January 2022 funding round that included investments from Sequoia Capital, BlackRock, SoftBank, Temasek, and dozens of other prestigious firms. When you're a $32 billion company, $300 million in real estate seems like a rounding error. The Bahamas base allowed FTX to operate with minimal regulatory oversight. The Bahamas had created the Digital Assets and Registered Exchanges Act, DARE, in 2020, legislation specifically designed to attract crypto companies with light-touch regulation. FTX obtained a license under DARE, giving them legal cover to operate an exchange without the stringent requirements that would apply in the US or Europe. This regulatory arbitrage was intentional. By headquartering in the Bahamas, FTX could offer services to international customers, including complex derivatives products that would have been prohibited or heavily restricted in jurisdictions with established financial regulations. They could avoid SEC registration, CFTC oversight, and the capital requirements that traditional exchanges must maintain. SBF cultivated relationships with Bahamian officials at the highest levels. He met with Prime Minister Philip Davis. FTX sponsored local initiatives, donated to charities, and positioned themselves as benefactors, bringing economic opportunity to the islands. The company became one of the Bahamas' largest employers, hiring hundreds locally for customer support, operations, and administrative roles. This produced goodwill that would later prove valuable when everything collapsed. Bahamian regulators would be among the last to take action against FTX, and there were suggestions that local officials had been too cozy with the company to provide meaningful oversight. But the Bahamas headquarters was about more than just regulatory arbitrage. It was about image. SBF wanted FTX to feel like the future, a tropical tech paradise where brilliant young people built revolutionary financial infrastructure while enjoying beaches and island life. The lifestyle reinforced this image. Photos and videos from the period show FTX executives living in luxury penthouses, hosting lavish parties, and enjoying the trappings of extraordinary wealth. Meanwhile, SBF maintained his personal brand of asceticism: cargo shorts, old t-shirts, sleeping on a beanbag, driving a beat-up car when he bothered to drive at all. This contrast was calculated. SBF could portray himself as the humble genius who didn't care about personal luxury, even while the company spent lavishly on offices, marketing, and executive compensation. He lived among wealth without appearing to enjoy it personally, maintaining his effective altruism credibility while building an empire. The marketing expenditures were staggering. In 2021 and 2022, FTX spent over $1 billion on advertising and sponsorships. They bought naming rights to the Miami Heat's arena for $135 million over 19 years, one of the most expensive naming rights deals in sports history. The building became FTX Arena, with the logo displayed prominently during nationally televised NBA games. They signed endorsement deals with Tom Brady and Gisele Bündchen, arguably the most famous power couple in America. Brady became a brand ambassador and took equity in FTX rather than cash compensation. The commercials featured Brady promoting FTX as the safe, easy way for regular people to invest in crypto. "I'm in, are you?" became the campaign's tagline. They sponsored Formula One racing, Major League Baseball umpires, whose uniforms featured FTX patches, and esports teams. They ran Super Bowl commercials featuring Larry David as a skeptic who dismisses every major innovation throughout history, ending with him dismissing FTX. The implication being that doubting FTX was as foolish as doubting the wheel or the light bulb. The spending aimed to establish FTX as the trusted mainstream crypto exchange, the platform your parents could use, not just crypto degenerates. This was crucial for attracting the retail customers who would provide the deposits Alameda needed to cover mounting losses. Behind the marketing blitz and luxury lifestyles was a company with virtually no financial controls. John Ray's bankruptcy filing would later reveal the operational chaos. QuickBooks was used for accounting at a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Employees submitted expense requests through Slack messages with emoji approvals. Literally, someone would post, "Need 200K for this thing," and another executive would respond with a thumbs-up emoji constituting approval. There was no proper distinction between corporate and personal expenses. SBF's parents lived in company-funded housing. Employees charged personal purchases to corporate cards without documentation. Executives loaned themselves money from FTX without formal agreements or repayment schedules. The corporate structure was deliberately convoluted. Over 130 affiliated entities spread across multiple jurisdictions, many with overlapping purposes and unclear relationships. This complexity served to obscure the flow of customer funds from FTX to Alameda. Money moved through multiple corporate entities, making it difficult even for insiders to track where customer deposits ultimately ended up. You see, the Bahamas empire projected success so convincingly that investors, customers, and regulators didn't look beneath the surface. The luxury offices, celebrity endorsements, and prestigious venture backing all served as social proof. If Sequoia and BlackRock invested hundreds of millions, surely FTX was legitimate. This was the genius of the fraud. SBF didn't operate from a sketchy office with unmarked accounts. He built something that looked and felt like a successful tech company. The fraud hid in plain sight, disguised by the trappings of legitimacy. The Bahamian lifestyle also created insularity. FTX's leadership lived together in a penthouse complex SBF nicknamed Orchid. Around 10 executives shared the space, working, living, and socializing together in a setup that blurred all boundaries between professional and personal life. Many were romantically involved with each other, creating a web of relationships that discouraged dissent or whistleblowing. Caroline Ellison, who'd become CEO of Alameda Research in late 2021, had an on-and-off romantic relationship with SBF. Gary Wang, FTX's CTO, was SBF's close friend from MIT. Nishad Singh, the director of engineering, had lived with SBF in Berkeley during Alameda's early days. These weren't just colleagues. They were a tight-knit group with shared history, ideology, and increasingly shared culpability for the fraud. The effective altruism philosophy pervaded everything. Many FTX employees had been recruited from EA circles. They genuinely believed they were building something world-changing. The rationalization was that crypto would democratize finance, and FTX was the vehicle for doing that responsibly. Any ethical corners cut in service of this mission could be justified by the greater good achieved. This ideology made the fraud easier to perpetuate internally. When executives questioned decisions, like Alameda's unlimited borrowing from FTX, SBF could frame objections as parochial concerns that ignored the bigger picture. They were going to make billions and donate it all to saving lives. Did a few accounting irregularities really matter compared to that impact? The Bahamas headquarters also facilitated another aspect of SBF's empire, political influence. From Nassau, SBF became one of the largest political donors in America, despite being just 29 years old. In the 2022 election cycle alone, he donated over $40 million to political candidates and committees, making him one of the top individual donors in the country. The donations flowed primarily to Democrats, though SBF also made substantial contributions to Republicans through other executives at FTX. He met with members of Congress, testified before committees, and funded think tanks and advocacy groups pushing for crypto-friendly regulation. The strategy was to establish FTX as a responsible industry leader that regulators should partner with rather than restrict. This political spending was remarkably effective. SBF gained access to senior officials at the White House, Treasury Department, and regulatory agencies. He was positioned as the crypto CEO who got it, who understood that regulation was necessary and wanted to work constructively with policymakers rather than fight them. But the donations were made with stolen money. Customer deposits that should have been held in reserve were instead flowing to political campaigns, often routed through straw donors to evade contribution limits. Prosecutors would later charge that SBF orchestrated an illegal campaign finance scheme alongside the fraud. The Bahamas empire reached its apex in early 2022. FTX's valuation hit $32 billion, Trading volumes remained strong despite broader crypto market weakness. The brand was ubiquitous. You couldn't watch sports without seeing FTX logos. And SBF's personal profile had never been higher. Magazine covers, conference keynotes, and speculation about his political ambitions. Think about it. In just 3 years, SBF had gone from a Jane Street trader with $1 million in savings to running a $32 billion company worth $26 billion personally on paper, and wielding political influence that rivaled established billionaires who'd spent decades accumulating power. The trajectory seemed almost impossibly steep. That should have been a warning sign. Fortunes built this quickly in unregulated industries rarely rest on solid foundations. But the crypto boom made extreme success seem normal. Coinbase had gone public at an $86 billion valuation. Binance was processing hundreds of billions in monthly volume. NFTs were selling for millions. In this context, FTX's rise seemed impressive, but not necessarily suspicious. The media coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Profiles emphasized SBF's quirky personality, the casual dress, the video game playing during meetings, the polyamorous relationship dynamics within the FTX inner circle. These eccentricities made him relatable to the young crypto audience and interesting to mainstream journalists looking for colorful characters. Very few reporters asked hard questions about FTX's finances. Where exactly were customer funds held? What were the relationships between FTX and Alameda? Why did FTX not have a US entity subject to American regulations? The few skeptical articles that raised these issues were drowned out by positive coverage from major outlets. Venture capitalists who invested hundreds of millions did cursory due diligence. Sequoia's glowing profile of SBF, published on their website and later deleted after the collapse, admitted they'd decided to invest after a single Zoom call. The article described watching SBF play League of Legends during their pitch meeting and being impressed by his multitasking rather than concerned about his attention. This was the reality of crypto investing in 2021-2022. Traditional due diligence standards didn't apply. FOMO dominated. If you passed on an investment, competitors would fund it and potentially make enormous returns. The incentive was to invest quickly with minimal scrutiny rather than carefully and miss opportunities. The Bahamas empire was built on this foundation of superficial legitimacy. Impressive offices, celebrity endorsements, venture capital backing, political connections, all the signals that typically indicate a successful company. But underneath was a hollow shell. Customer funds being stolen to cover trading losses, no real financial controls, and leadership that knew exactly what they were doing. By mid-2022, the cracks were starting to show even if the public couldn't see them. Alameda's losses in the crypto crash had been severe, billions in bad trades as Bitcoin dropped from $69,000 to $20,000. FTX's trading volumes had declined as the retail mania faded. And most critically, the gap between customer deposits and available funds was growing to a scale that couldn't be hidden much longer. The Bahamas empire was about to come crashing down, but first we need to understand exactly how the fraud worked, the mechanics of how $8 billion in customer funds disappeared into Alameda's accounts. Chapter 4: Alameda's Secret. Caroline Ellison knew the secret from the beginning. As CEO of Alameda Research starting in late 2021, she understood that the trading firm had special access to FTX customer funds, access that no other market participant had and that customers certainly didn't know about. She would later testify that this arrangement made her extremely uncomfortable, but she continued operating under it anyway. The mechanics were shockingly simple for such a massive fraud. When customers deposited funds into their FTX accounts, whether dollars, Bitcoin, Ethereum, or any other cryptocurrency, those assets were supposed to be held in segregated wallets and bank accounts. The funds belonged to customers. FTX merely facilitated trades between customers and provided custody services, similar to how a traditional brokerage holds stocks for clients. But that's not how FTX actually operated. Customer deposits flowed into a system where Alameda Research had backdoor access. Through a special line of credit coded directly into FTX's software by CTO Gary Wang, Alameda could borrow customer funds without the usual constraints that applied to other trading firms on the platform. The credit line was initially set at $65 billion, a number so absurdly large that it could only mean one thing. Alameda could take essentially unlimited amounts from customer deposits. There was no commercial justification for a trading firm to need $65 billion in borrowing capacity. The entire global hedge fund industry didn't borrow that much collectively from prime brokers. This special treatment was coded into FTX's core systems. Normal customers who traded on FTX had margin requirements. They could only borrow limited amounts based on their collateral, and they'd face automatic liquidations if positions moved against them. Alameda had no such constraints. They could accumulate massive losses without automatic liquidations. They could withdraw funds that technically belonged to customers. Gary Wang, SBF's MIT roommate and FTX's technical architect, wrote the code that enabled this. He later pleaded guilty to fraud and testified that SBF explicitly directed him to create these special exemptions for Alameda. This wasn't an accident or a technical glitch. It was intentional architecture designed to facilitate fraud. The flow worked like this. A customer deposits $10,000 into their FTX account. That $10,000 doesn't sit in a segregated wallet. Instead, it goes into FTX's general accounts, where it becomes mixed with other customer funds and corporate assets. Alameda then borrows that $10,000 along with billions from other customers to fund trading operations, investments, and personal expenditures. On FTX's internal accounting, such as it was, this showed up as a loan from FTX to Alameda. But there were no formal loan agreements, no interest rates, no repayment schedules, and no collateral requirements. The loan was just an accounting entry that papered over theft. When the customer wanted to withdraw their $10,000, FTX would typically honor the withdrawal if sufficient liquidity existed from other customer deposits or from Alameda returning funds. As long as new deposits exceeded withdrawals, the scheme could continue indefinitely. This is the fundamental structure of every Ponzi scheme and every bank run throughout history. But here's what made the fraud particularly egregious. Alameda was simultaneously one of the largest trading firms on FTX. They were executing enormous volumes of trades on the platform, market making, derivatives trading, and directional bets. This meant Alameda had legitimate reasons to hold funds on FTX for trading purposes. This created confusion that helped hide the fraud. Alameda was supposed to have money on FTX. That was part of their business. The fraud was that they were borrowing far more than their trading activities required, and the excess was coming from customer deposits rather than Alameda's own capital. The internal rationalization went something like this. Alameda needs liquidity for market making. FTX has customer deposits sitting idle. Rather than keeping those deposits completely segregated, we'll let Alameda access them to provide better liquidity on the platform. This helps everyone. Customers get tighter spreads. Alameda makes more efficient use of capital. FTX grows faster. This rationalization ignored a crucial fact. The customer deposits weren't Alameda's or FTX's to use. They belonged to customers who deposited them for the specific purpose of trading on FTX, not to fund Alameda's operations. Using them for any other purpose was theft, regardless of how it was framed internally. Caroline Ellison described the arrangement in her testimony as creating essentially unlimited ability for Alameda to borrow from FTX. And that unlimited borrowing was backed by customer assets that customers thought were safely held in their exchange accounts. The scheme required ongoing lies to customers, investors, and regulators. FTX's terms of service explicitly stated that customer assets were held separately from corporate funds. SBF repeatedly claimed in interviews that FTX never used customer funds for investments or trading, a direct lie that he told to journalists on podcasts and in congressional testimony. Look, in 2022, as the crypto market crashed, Alameda's losses mounted catastrophically. They'd been long on crypto assets, meaning they owned large positions betting prices would rise. When Bitcoin dropped from $69,000 to below $20,000, and when dozens of altcoins lost 80–90% of their value, Alameda's portfolio was decimated. The losses were compounded by leverage. Alameda had borrowed heavily to amplify their positions. In a rising market, leverage multiplies gains. In a falling market, it multiplies losses. Alameda found themselves with billions in losses that exceeded their own capital. Normal trading firms would face margin calls at this point. Their lenders would demand additional collateral or force liquidation of positions, but Alameda's primary lender was FTX, which meant it was effectively SBF lending to himself. There were no margin calls. Instead, Alameda simply borrowed more customer funds from FTX to cover the losses and maintain their positions. By mid-2022, Alameda had borrowed approximately $8 billion from FTX, money that came directly from customer deposits. This $8 billion represented the hole in FTX's balance sheet. When customers looked at their account balances on FTX's interface, they saw their deposits and holdings. But those assets didn't actually exist in FTX's wallets. They existed as a liability on FTX's books, supposedly owed by Alameda, backed by Alameda's rapidly depreciating crypto holdings. The composition of Alameda's collateral made the situation even worse. A substantial portion of their assets was held in FTT, the token that FTX itself had created and issued. FTT was designed as a utility token that gave holders discounts on FTX trading fees and other benefits. FTX had issued billions of FTT tokens, many of which Alameda held. On paper, Alameda's FTT holdings were worth billions based on the token's market price. But this was circular logic. FTT's value depended on FTX's success and credibility. If FTX failed, FTT would become worthless. So Alameda was using a token created by their sister company to back borrowings from that same company, collateral that would evaporate the moment people lost faith in the ecosystem. This is like a bank lending money to its CEO, who uses the bank's own stock as collateral. If the bank fails, the collateral becomes worthless and the loan can never be repaid. It's a fundamentally circular and unsustainable structure. Several Alameda employees raised concerns about this arrangement over time. Some left the company specifically because they were uncomfortable with the relationship between Alameda and FTX. But those who stayed, particularly senior leadership like Caroline Ellison, Gary Wang, and Nishad Singh, accepted the structure and continued operating within it. The effective altruism philosophy again played a role in rationalization. These were smart people who understood they were engaged in fraud, but they'd convinced themselves that the ends justified the means. SBF was going to make tens of billions and donate it all. If some accounting rules were bent to achieve that goal, wasn't that acceptable given the magnitude of good that would result? This is textbook utilitarian reasoning taken to a criminal extreme. Murder could be justified if it prevented greater harm. Theft could be justified if the stolen funds were used for sufficiently important purposes. Any action, no matter how normally unethical, could be justified if the consequences were positive enough. The ideology created a closed loop of rationalization that prevented moral correction. When someone raised concerns, the response was to emphasize the greater mission. They weren't stealing, they were optimizing capital allocation to maximize charitable impact. The customers wouldn't be harmed because FTX would remain solvent and grow large enough to repay what was borrowed, except it was stealing. And customers were harmed and FTX didn't remain solvent. By October 2022, Alameda Research was insolvent by any reasonable accounting standard. Their liabilities, primarily the money borrowed from FTX, exceeded their assets by billions. The only thing keeping them operating was continued access to FTX customer deposits and the hope that crypto markets would recover enough to close the gap. Caroline Ellison knew this. She'd been trying to manage Alameda's positions to reduce risk exposure, but the hole was too large to fix through normal trading. In private messages that would later be revealed, she expressed anxiety about the situation and frustration about the impossible position she'd been put in. But she didn't blow the whistle. She didn't refuse to continue. She didn't resign and inform regulators. Instead, she kept operating Alameda while it was billions underwater, using customer money from FTX to cover daily operations and tried desperately to trade back to solvency. This is the pattern in almost every major fraud. People who know it's wrong continue anyway, because stopping would require admitting guilt, facing consequences, and abandoning the hope that somehow things will work out. The fraud spiral continues until external forces, usually market conditions or whistleblowers, force a reckoning. For FTX and Alameda, that reckoning was approaching. In November 2022, the secret that Caroline Ellison, Sam Bankman-Fried, Gary Wang, Nishad Singh, and others had kept for years was about to explode into public view. The collapse would happen not because of regulatory investigation or customer complaints, but because of one tweet from a rival CEO who'd spotted weakness in FTX's armor. That tweet would trigger a bank run that would expose the $8 billion hole in FTX's balance sheet and destroy Sam Bankman-Fried's empire in less than a week. Alameda's secret was about to become the world's knowledge, and when it did, the consequences would be catastrophic. Chapter 5: Customer Money. The critical question in every financial fraud is, where did the money actually go? In FTX's case, $8 billion in customer deposits disappeared. Not lost to market volatility, though Alameda certainly lost billions on bad trades. Not stolen by hackers, though FTX's security was remarkably lax. The money was systematically transferred from customer accounts into a web of users that enriched SBF, his family and his associates, while funding an increasingly desperate attempt to cover losses. Let's trace the flow, because understanding where the money went reveals the nature of the fraud. The single largest category was Alameda's trading losses. From late 2021 through 2022, as crypto markets crashed, Alameda lost billions on leveraged positions. They'd been long on numerous altcoins that collapsed in value. They'd made bad bets on DeFi protocols that imploded. They'd provided liquidity to platforms like Voyager and BlockFi that later went bankrupt, rendering those loans worthless. Exact figures are hard to determine because Alameda's accounting was so poor. But bankruptcy filings suggest trading losses in the range of $3 to $4 billion. These losses were covered by continuously borrowing from FTX customer deposits. Every time Alameda lost money on a trade, they'd pull more from FTX to maintain their positions and continue operating. The second major category was investments in various crypto projects and venture deals. Using FTX and Alameda funds, which remember, included customer money, SBF invested billions in over 400 different companies and projects. Some investments were strategic bets on crypto infrastructure. Others were vanity projects in unrelated industries. The investment portfolio included stakes in Anthropic, the AI company, Genesis Digital Assets, a Bitcoin mining operation, Dave, a banking app, and hundreds of others ranging from legitimate companies to obvious scams. Many were negotiated personally by SBF with minimal due diligence. The bankruptcy team would later describe these investments as largely worthless, paper valuations based on inflated fundraising rounds rather than genuine market value. These investments represented at least $2–3 billion in customer funds deployed into illiquid venture deals that couldn't be readily converted back to cash when FTX needed to honor withdrawals. SBF had essentially taken customer money deposited for trading purposes and stuck it into long-term investment positions that customers never authorized. The third category was real estate. As discussed earlier, FTX executives purchased over $300 million in Bahamian luxury properties using company funds. SBF's parents alone acquired property worth tens of millions. The penthouse complex where the leadership lived represented one of the most expensive real estate portfolios in the Bahamas. These purchases were sometimes made through FTX directly, sometimes through Alameda, and sometimes through various subsidiary entities. But regardless of the corporate structure, the money originated from customer deposits. When SBF bought a $30 million penthouse, that money came from customers who thought their funds were being held safely on the exchange. Category 4: Political donations. SBF donated over $40 million in disclosed contributions during the 2022 election cycle alone. The true figure was likely much higher when including dark money contributions through intermediaries. Ryan Salame, co-CEO of FTX Digital Markets, was also a massive donor, contributing tens of millions primarily to Republicans. These political donations were made with stolen money. Customer deposits flowed from FTX to Alameda to SBF personally. then to political campaigns and passes. Prosecutors allege that SBF deliberately structured donations through straw donors to evade campaign finance limits, adding campaign finance violations on top of fraud charges. The political spending served multiple purposes. It bought access to policymakers who could shape crypto regulation favorably. It built SBF's personal brand as a major political player. And it created a network of politicians who were financially dependent on SBF's continued generosity. People who might be reluctant to criticize FTX even if red flags appeared. Category 5. Luxury expenditures and operational waste. FTX spent lavishly on everything from office space to private jets to celebrity endorsements. The $1 billion in marketing expenditures during 2021-2022 came from a mix of legitimate company revenue and customer deposits that should have been segregated. When FTX paid Tom Brady $55 million for endorsement rights, where did that money come from? Partially from trading revenues, but partially from the pool of funds that included customer money. The luxury offices in the Bahamas, the private planes SBF used to fly to political fundraisers, the expensive hotels when traveling, all of this was funded by an entity that was supposed to be holding customer deposits separately from corporate operations. The bankruptcy team found that basic internal controls were absent. There was no formal approval process for large expenditures. SBF could authorize spending with a Slack message. The distinction between FTX money, Alameda money, and customer money was essentially non-existent in practice. You see, Category 6 was loans and gifts to executives and friends. SBF loaned or gave hundreds of millions to FTX and Alameda employees, sometimes documented, often not. Nishad Singh received $543 million in loans and payments. Ryan Salame received over $100 million. These weren't normal compensation. They were extraordinary transfers that enriched a small group at customer expense. Some of these transfers were labeled loans, though many had no formal agreements, no interest payments, and no realistic expectation of repayment. Others were structured as bonuses or other compensation, but the amounts were grossly disproportionate to actual work performed. They were effectively gifts from customer funds to SBF's friends and associates. The bankruptcy team also found hundreds of millions in expenditures that simply couldn't be accounted for. Money that left FTX's accounts with no documentation of where it went or what it was for. This could reflect poor record keeping, or it could reflect cash being taken directly by executives with no attempt to create even superficial justification. Let's add it up. $3–4 billion in trading losses at Alameda, $2 to $3 billion in illiquid venture investments, $300+ million in real estate, $100+ million in political donations, $1 billion in marketing and operations, $1+ billion in executive loans and compensation, plus unaccounted transfers of hundreds of millions more. The total easily exceeds $8 billion. The gap between what customers believed FTX held and what actually remained when the company collapsed. Customer money had been systematically looted to fund a lifestyle, a political operation, and a desperate attempt to trade out of insolvency. What makes this particularly galling is that customers had no idea any of this was happening. When they logged into FTX, they saw their account balances showing their deposited funds. The interface looked like any legitimate exchange. They could execute trades normally, at least until the final days when withdrawals were frozen. Behind that interface, their money was gone. The balance sheet was fiction. FTX was showing customers they owned assets that FTX no longer possessed. This is fundamentally no different from a bank embezzler adjusting computer records to hide missing deposits. The customer money was also used to perpetuate the fraud by creating an illusion of success. The Super Bowl commercials, the arena naming rights, the celebrity endorsements, all of this marketing reassured customers that FTX was legitimate and successful. After all, would a fraudulent company spend $135 million on naming rights to an NBA arena? Yes, they would, especially when using stolen customer funds to create legitimacy that attracts more customers whose deposits can then also be stolen. The marketing wasn't separate from the fraud. It was integral to the fraud's continuation. Some customers deposited their entire life savings into FTX, trusting assurances that their assets were safe. Retirees put pension money into what they thought was a legitimate investment platform. People in developing countries used FTX as a savings vehicle, believing it was more stable than their local banking systems. These customers lost everything. Not because they made bad investment decisions, they didn't even get the chance to invest. They lost money because the exchange was stealing from them from the moment they deposited funds. The human toll of this fraud is difficult to quantify. Individual customers losing tens or hundreds of thousands, families losing homes because their savings were on FTX, small businesses that used FTX for international payments left unable to operate, charitable organizations that held reserves on FTX suddenly insolvent. Over 1 million customers worldwide were affected. The bankruptcy process would eventually recover some funds, but customers would lose significant percentages of their deposits. Many would wait years for partial recovery, if they got anything at all. Think about the betrayal involved. SBF deliberately positioned himself as the trustworthy face of crypto. He advocated for regulation, testified before Congress about consumer protections, and criticized less scrupulous operators in the industry, all while running one of the largest frauds in the sector's history. Customers trusted him specifically because of the reputation he'd cultivated. The effective altruism philosophy, the advocacy for regulation, the mainstream credibility, these weren't incidental to the fraud. They were essential to convincing people to deposit money that would be stolen. This distinguishes FTX from obvious scams. Nobody who lost money on an anonymous DeFi protocol run by pseudonymous developers can claim they didn't understand the risks. But FTX customers had legitimate reasons to believe their funds were safe. The platform was backed by sophisticated investors. It was licensed in multiple jurisdictions. Its founder was a respected figure who'd testified before the US Congress. The betrayal of that trust is what makes the fraud so egregious. SBF didn't just steal. He deliberately built credibility specifically to enable stealing on a larger scale. Every media appearance, every regulatory testimony, every effective altruism discussion was part of a con that made the eventual theft possible. The customer money question is ultimately about accountability. In traditional finance, multiple layers of protection exist to prevent this kind of theft. Regulated exchanges must segregate customer funds. They face regular audits. They must maintain capital reserves. They're subject to oversight by agencies like the SEC or CFTC. FTX operated outside this regulatory framework intentionally. By basing in the Bahamas and avoiding US registration, they evaded the protections that would have prevented or quickly detected the fraud. The deregulated environment that many in crypto celebrated as freedom proved to be freedom to steal. When FTX customers deposited funds, they became unsecured creditors of a fraudulent enterprise. They had no FDIC insurance, no SIPC protection, no regulatory backstop. When the fraud collapsed, they were left fighting with thousands of other creditors for scraps from the bankruptcy. This is the cost of financial innovation that prioritizes avoiding regulation over protecting customers. FTX couldn't have operated the way it did in a properly regulated environment. The fraud was enabled by regulatory arbitrage, deliberately choosing jurisdictions with minimal oversight. Customer money, $8 billion of it, was stolen to fund Sam Bankman-Fried's empire. Not borrowed temporarily and repaid, not lost to unfortunate circumstances beyond anyone's control, deliberately taken and used for purposes customers never authorized. That theft is why SBF now faces the rest of his life in prison. Because when you steal $8 billion from over 1 million people while pretending to be a respectable businessman, the law eventually catches up, even in the wild west of cryptocurrency. Chapter 6. The Unraveling. The collapse started with a single tweet on November 6, 2022. Changpeng Zhao, known as CZ, was the founder and CEO of Binance, the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange, and FTX's primary competitor. On that Sunday, CZ announced that Binance would be selling its entire holding of FTT tokens, worth approximately $500 million. The tweet was carefully worded. As part of Binance's exit from FTX equity last year, Binance received roughly $2.1 billion USD equivalent in cash, BUSD, and FTT. Due to recent revelations that have come to light, we have decided to liquidate any remaining FTT on our books. The recent revelations referred to an article published 2 days earlier by CoinDesk reporter Ian Allison. The article examined Alameda Research's balance sheet, leaked from a private document, and revealed that a massive portion of Alameda's assets consisted of FTT tokens. Specifically, Alameda held $3.66 billion in unlocked FTT and $2.16 billion in FTT collateral. This was alarming for several reasons. First, it showed that Alameda's supposedly diversified trading portfolio was actually concentrated in a single token created by their sister company. Second, it suggested Alameda might be over-leveraged, using FTT as collateral for borrowings, despite the token's limited liquidity. Third, it raised questions about the true independence of FTX and Alameda if Alameda's solvency depended so heavily on FTX's token. CZ's announcement that Binance would sell their FTT holdings triggered immediate panic. FTT's price began dropping as traders anticipated Binance dumping $500 million worth of tokens onto the market. Other holders rushed to sell before the price fell further. Within hours, FTT had dropped from $22 to below $15, a 30% plus decline. But the price drop was just the beginning of FTX's problems. The real crisis was the bank run that CZ's tweet triggered. Customers saw the CoinDesk article and CZ's announcement and began questioning whether their funds were safe on FTX. If Alameda was over-leveraged and holding mostly FTT, and if FTX and Alameda were closely connected, did that mean FTX itself was at risk? Within hours, withdrawal requests began flooding in. On November 6th, customers attempted to withdraw approximately $1 billion from FTX. The exchange initially processed withdrawals normally, but processing slowed significantly as the day progressed. By evening, customers were reporting delays of several hours for withdrawals that normally completed in minutes. Bankman-Fried attempted damage control through Twitter. He posted a thread on November 7th claiming that FTX was fine and that assets are fine. He wrote, "FTX has enough to cover all client holdings. We don't invest client assets, even in treasuries." He assured customers that withdrawals were processing and urged them not to panic. Every word of this was a lie. FTX did not have enough to cover client holdings. They were short approximately $8 billion. They absolutely had invested client assets, specifically by lending them to Alameda. And withdrawals were not processing normally. They were slowing to a crawl because FTX didn't have the liquidity to meet redemptions. Caroline Ellison, seeing the crisis unfold, attempted her own intervention. She tweeted that if CZ wanted to minimize market impact from selling FTT, Alameda would be happy to buy all of Binance's FTT holdings at $22 per token. This was a desperate attempt to prevent a full collapse of FTT's price, which would render Alameda's collateral worthless. But CZ ignored the offer. He had no intention of negotiating with Alameda. Some speculated that CZ had deliberately triggered the crisis, that he'd spotted FTX's vulnerability and decided to take out his primary competitor. Others suggested CZ was simply protecting Binance by distancing from a potential fraud. Whatever his motivation, CZ's actions would prove devastating to FTX. By November 8th, the situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Customers had attempted to withdraw over $5 billion in just 3 days, nearly half of FTX's supposed assets under custody. The exchange couldn't meet these withdrawals because the money wasn't there. FTX suspended withdrawals entirely, trapping customer funds on the platform. This confirmation of insolvency triggered total panic. Social media exploded with anger from customers who couldn't access their money. Crypto media published hourly updates as the crisis escalated. Competitors like Coinbase and Kraken saw massive inflows as customers fled any exchange that seemed remotely similar to FTX. SBF made increasingly desperate moves. On November 8th, he announced that FTX had reached an agreement for Binance to acquire the company, a stunning reversal where FTX's primary competitor would take them over in an emergency rescue deal. The announcement briefly calmed markets and gave hope that customer funds might be protected through the acquisition. But the rescue lasted less than 24 hours. On November 9th, Binance announced they were walking away from the deal after conducting preliminary due diligence. Their statement cited concerns about corporate due diligence and reports of mishandled customer funds and regulatory investigations. What Binance had discovered in their quick review was enough to send them running. The commingling of customer funds with Alameda, the $8 billion hole in the balance sheet, the lack of any meaningful financial controls. Binance immediately realized that FTX wasn't merely illiquid, but fundamentally insolvent and potentially fraudulent. Taking over FTX's liabilities would have destroyed Binance itself. Look, with the Binance rescue dead, FTX had no path forward. They couldn't meet customer withdrawals, they couldn't raise emergency funding because any sophisticated investor conducting due diligence would immediately see the fraud. They couldn't somehow trade their way back to solvency because the losses were too large and the market conditions too poor. SBF spent November 9th and 10 in increasingly frantic attempts to raise emergency funding. He reached out to every investor, every crypto billionaire, every potential source of capital. He needed approximately $8 billion to fill the hole and resume normal operations. He offered equity stakes, personal guarantees, anything that might attract rescue capital. Nobody bit. Word had spread in investment circles about the magnitude of FTX's problems. Investors who'd poured billions into FTX at a $32 billion valuation just months earlier now wouldn't provide emergency funding at any price. The due diligence calls revealed a company that was essentially a fraud from inception. The final days saw SBF's public persona completely collapse. His Twitter feed, previously filled with confident assertions and philosophical musings, became a stream of apologies and desperate explanations. He admitted that FTX had failed to properly segregate customer assets. He claimed he hadn't realized how bad things were, a laughable assertion given his total control over both FTX and Alameda. On November 11, 2022, at approximately 7:30 a.m. Bahamas time, FTX filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing included FTX Trading Ltd, Alameda Research, and over 130 affiliated entities. Sam Bankman-Fried resigned as CEO, with John J. Ray III appointed to manage the bankruptcy process. The bankruptcy filing revealed the scope of the disaster. FTX listed over 100,000 creditors, likely over 1 million when accounting for all customer claims. Assets and liabilities were both listed as between $10 and $50 billion, though the true figures were unclear, given the complete absence of reliable financial records. Within hours of the bankruptcy filing, the Bahamian headquarters was in chaos. Employees who'd believed they were working for a successful tech company discovered they'd been participants in a massive fraud. Many would face their own legal jeopardy for actions taken on SBF's behalf. The luxury penthouse complex that had housed FTX's leadership became a crime scene as regulators and investigators moved in. That same day, approximately $477 million in cryptocurrency was mysteriously withdrawn from FTX's wallets in what appeared to be a hack. The timing, just hours after bankruptcy, suggested either an external attacker taking advantage of the chaos or an insider stealing whatever remained before it could be frozen. The hack added insult to injury for customers who'd already lost billions. SBF remained in the Bahamas initially, giving scattered media interviews where he claimed ignorance of the full extent of the problems. He portrayed himself as an overwhelmed CEO who'd lost track of details as the company grew too fast. He insisted he'd never intended to defraud anyone. Losses had occurred due to accounting failures and market conditions beyond his control. These explanations convinced nobody. The evidence was already emerging that SBF had knowingly directed the commingling of customer funds with Alameda operations. His claims of ignorance were contradicted by encrypted signal messages showing him discussing exactly how much customer money Alameda had borrowed. The fraud had been deliberate, systematic, and operated with SBF's full knowledge and approval. The unraveling had taken less than 1 week from CZ's initial tweet to FTX's bankruptcy. A company valued at $32 billion, processing billions in daily volume, backed by the world's most sophisticated investors, had collapsed faster than almost any major financial institution in history. The speed of the collapse revealed the fundamental emptiness underneath. FTX hadn't been a real business that encountered temporary problems. It had been a fraud held together by continuous growth and market momentum. The moment withdrawals exceeded deposits, the entire structure imploded because there was nothing solid supporting it. For the million-plus customers with funds trapped on FTX, the unraveling meant financial devastation. Retirement savings gone, business operating capital frozen, life savings evaporated. Many customers had believed SBF's assurances right up until withdrawals were suspended. They trusted the celebrity endorsements, the regulatory testimony, the venture capital backing. That trust was betrayed completely. The unraveling wasn't just a business failure. It was the exposure of a fraud that had stolen billions while maintaining a facade of legitimacy and responsibility. Within days, the criminal investigation began. Federal prosecutors in Manhattan started building cases. The SEC and CFTC launched enforcement actions. Bahamian authorities froze assets and restricted SBF's movements. The empire that had taken 3 years to build had been completely destroyed in 1 week of catastrophic unraveling. And it was about to get worse for Sam Bankman-Fried. Because as investigators dug into FTX's records, they would discover that the $8 billion hole in customer funds wasn't an accident or a temporary liquidity problem. It was theft, pure and simple, and they had the receipts to prove it. Chapter 7. Desperate Moves. In the final weeks before FTX's collapse, Sam Bankman-Fried made increasingly desperate moves to cover the $8 billion hole and prevent disaster. The first sign that SBF knew catastrophe was approaching came in September 2022. FTX's balance sheet was deteriorating rapidly as Alameda's losses mounted and crypto market conditions worsened. Customer withdrawals were beginning to exceed deposits, the death spiral for any fractional reserve scheme. SBF needed emergency capital fast. He turned to existing investors, pitching them on a down round, a new funding round at a lower valuation than FTX's previous $32 billion peak. This was unusual for a company that publicly claimed to be profitable and growing. Why would a successful company need emergency funding at a reduced valuation? The pitch to investors was vague about the specific problems FTX faced. SBF described accounting irregularities and liquidity management challenges without revealing the core issue. Alameda had stolen $8 billion in customer funds and lost most of it. He claimed FTX needed $4.6 billion to shore up the balance sheet and support growth opportunities. Several existing investors expressed interest in participating in an emergency round, but the due diligence process kept hitting obstacles. SBF was reluctant to provide detailed financial statements. The relationship between FTX and Alameda remained murky. Questions about customer fund segregation received evasive answers. Investors kept asking for audited financials, which FTX had never produced despite being a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The fundraising efforts collapsed without closing any deals. Sophisticated investors conducting even basic due diligence discovered problems that made FTX uninvestable. The company's valuation had been built on metrics like trading volume and user growth, not actual examination of the balance sheet. Once investors looked at the fundamentals, the fraud became apparent. SBF's second desperate move was attempting to generate revenue through increasingly aggressive business tactics. FTX started pushing high-leverage products to retail customers, 100x leverage on cryptocurrency trades, which almost guaranteed customer losses but generated fees for FTX. They expanded into stock tokens, cryptocurrency representations of companies like Apple and Tesla, despite questionable regulatory status. These revenue-generating tactics brought in hundreds of millions, but nowhere near enough to cover the $8 billion gap. Moreover, the aggressive promotion of high-risk products to retail customers would later be used as evidence of FTX's reckless disregard for customer welfare, demonstrating that even as the company collapsed, leadership prioritized extracting fees over protecting users. The third move involved attempting to prop up FTT token prices. Remember, Alameda's collateral consisted largely of FTT. If FTT's price collapsed, Alameda's balance sheet would show even larger losses, making the fraud harder to hide. So Alameda engaged in price manipulation, using customer funds from FTX to buy FTT in the market, artificially supporting its price. This manipulation was expensive and ultimately futile. Every dollar spent buying FTT was another dollar of customer money thrown away. The price support worked temporarily, but was unsustainable. Once Alameda stopped buying, the natural market price, far below where they'd tried to maintain it, would reassert itself. Prosecutors would later charge that this market manipulation violated securities laws and constituted wire fraud, using electronic communications to execute a fraudulent scheme. SBF had used customer money not only to cover Alameda's losses, but also to manipulate markets in ways that concealed those losses from investors and regulators. The fourth desperate move was political. In October and early November 2022, even as FTX was collapsing internally, SBF ramped up political engagement. He donated millions to midterm election candidates just weeks before the bankruptcy. He met with regulators to discuss crypto policy proposals. He positioned himself as a voice for responsible regulation. This political activity served dual purposes. First, it maintained the public image of FTX as a successful, responsible company. If they were on the verge of collapse, why would their CEO be donating millions to political campaigns and testifying before Congress? Second, it cultivated relationships with politicians and regulators who might be useful if the fraud was discovered and legal jeopardy followed. The political spending in this period was particularly brazen because SBF knew FTX was insolvent. He was donating customer money, funds that belonged to people who would soon discover their accounts were empty. The donations couldn't even be justified as marketing expenses for a legitimate business. They were theft compounded by attempts to buy political protection. SBF's fifth move involved attempting to merge or sell pieces of FTX to generate cash. He approached multiple companies about acquiring FTX's various business units, the US entity, FTX US, the international exchange, the venture portfolio, even the Bahamian real estate. The goal was to monetize anything possible to raise funds to cover the customer shortfall. These discussions went nowhere. Potential acquirers conducting due diligence quickly realized FTX's assets were either worthless or legally encumbered. The venture portfolio consisted of illiquid positions in mostly failing companies. The real estate was purchased with funds that were now subject to clawback in bankruptcy. The actual operating businesses couldn't be separated from the fraud. Buying FTX meant assuming liability for customer losses. You see, SBF also attempted to negotiate settlements with rival exchanges. He approached Binance, Coinbase, and others about agreements where they would provide liquidity to FTX in exchange for equity stakes or future revenue sharing. These discussions were absurd on their face. Why would competitors provide billions to rescue a rival that was clearly fraudulent? But desperation produces irrational behavior. SBF was throwing everything at the wall hoping something would stick. Every meeting, every pitch, every deal discussion was an attempt to somehow find $8 billion before the world discovered it was missing. The sixth move was internal, attempting to preserve key personnel and prevent whistleblowers. As the crisis deepened, FTX leadership became concerned that employees who understood the fraud might flee and contact authorities. SBF offered massive retention bonuses to critical employees, particularly those in engineering and operations who kept the systems running. These bonuses came from customer funds, but were framed as necessary business expenses. Employees were told that FTX was facing challenges, but would survive if everyone stuck together. The effective altruism community messaging intensified. They were all part of a mission larger than themselves, and abandoning ship would mean abandoning the potential good they could do collectively. Some employees did leave during this period, uncomfortable with what they were seeing, but most stayed either believing SBF's explanations or feeling complicit enough that leaving would require admitting their own involvement in fraud. The retention strategy worked until the very end. FTX kept operating right up until the bankruptcy filing. The seventh desperate move was media management. In October 2022, SBF embarked on a blitz of podcast interviews, conference appearances, and media profiles. The message was consistent. FTX was thriving. The crypto winter was creating opportunity for strong companies, and responsible players like FTX would emerge stronger as weaker competitors failed. The unraveling had taken less than 1 week from CZ's initial tweet to FTX's bankruptcy. A company valued at $32 billion, processing billions in daily volume, backed by the world's most sophisticated investors, had collapsed faster than almost any major financial institution in history. The speed of the collapse revealed the fundamental emptiness underneath. FTX hadn't been a real business that encountered temporary problems. It had been a fraud held together by continuous growth and market momentum. The moment withdrawals exceeded deposits, the entire structure imploded because there was nothing solid supporting it. For the million-plus customers with funds trapped on FTX, the unraveling meant financial devastation. Retirement savings gone, business operating capital frozen, life savings evaporated. Many customers had believed SBF's assurances right up until withdrawals were suspended. They trusted the celebrity endorsements, the regulatory testimony, the venture capital backing. That trust was betrayed completely. The unraveling wasn't just a business failure. It was the exposure of a fraud that had stolen billions while maintaining a facade of legitimacy and responsibility. Within days, the criminal investigation began. Federal prosecutors in Manhattan started building cases. The SEC and CFTC launched enforcement actions. Bahamian authorities froze assets and restricted SBF's movements. The empire that had taken 3 years to build had been completely destroyed in 1 week of catastrophic unraveling. And it was about to get worse for Sam Bankman-Fried. Because as investigators dug into FTX's records, they would discover that the $8 billion hole in customer funds wasn't an accident or a temporary liquidity problem. It was theft, pure and simple, and they had the receipts to prove it. Chapter 8. Total Collapse. The arrest came on December 12, 2022, exactly 1 month after FTX's bankruptcy filing. Bahamian police took Sam Bankman-Fried into custody at his apartment in Nassau. He'd been living under loose house arrest since the collapse, though he'd maintained his penthouse and continued giving media interviews. The Bahamas had initially resisted extraditing him, but US prosecutors had filed criminal charges and secured Bahamian cooperation. The indictment from the Southern District of New York was devastating. 8 counts: wire fraud on customers, wire fraud on lenders, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, conspiracy to commit commodities fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Each count carried potential sentences of 5 to 20 years in prison. SBF faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life incarcerated. The charging documents laid out the fraud in detail. Prosecutors had obtained internal signal messages, encrypted chats, and financial records showing SBF's direct involvement in stealing customer funds. There were messages where he discussed exactly how much customer money Alameda had borrowed, documents showing he'd directed Gary Wang to create special code exempting Alameda from normal liquidation procedures, evidence of political donations made with customer funds routed through straw donors. This wasn't a case of negligent management or accounting failures. The evidence showed deliberate, systematic fraud directed personally by Sam Bankman-Fried from the company's inception. Within days, Gary Wang and Caroline Ellison both pleaded guilty to criminal charges and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. They would testify against SBF in exchange for potentially reduced sentences. Their cooperation was devastating. As FTX's CTO and Alameda's CEO, they had direct knowledge of every aspect of the fraud. Nishad Singh, the director of engineering, also pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate shortly thereafter. Ryan Salami, who'd run FTX's Bahamian operations, was eventually charged with campaign finance violations and bank fraud. The inner circle that had enabled the fraud was systematically flipping to cooperate against SBF. SBF was extradited to the United States on December 21, 2022. He was initially held in federal detention, then released on $250 million bond secured by his parents' California home and guaranteed by family and friends. The bail conditions confined him to his parents' Palo Alto residence with electronic monitoring. From house arrest, SBF made a catastrophic decision. He continued talking to the media. Against his lawyer's advice, he gave interviews to reporters, wrote a lengthy Substack post explaining his perspective and engaged extensively on Twitter. He portrayed himself as a well-intentioned CEO who'd lost control of a fast-growing company, not a criminal who'd systematically stolen billions. These statements would later be used against him in court. Prosecutors introduced SBF's media comments as evidence of consciousness of guilt. He'd made claims that were contradicted by evidence obtained through discovery. His attempts to manage public perception had created a record of lies that undermined any defense strategy his lawyers might attempt. The bankruptcy proceeding revealed the full extent of the disaster. John J. Ray III, the attorney who'd cleaned up Enron's bankruptcy, filed scathing reports about FTX's operations. His first declaration included the now famous statement, "Never in my career have I seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information as occurred here." Ray's team found that approximately $8.9 billion in customer funds were missing, slightly more than initial estimates. They identified only about $1.1 billion in liquid assets that could be immediately recovered. The venture portfolio that SBF had claimed was worth billions turned out to be largely worthless. Many investments were in failed companies or tokens with no market value. The bankruptcy team also discovered extensive fraud beyond just customer fund theft. FTX had purchased millions in luxury goods and real estate using customer money. Company credit cards had been used for personal expenses. Property titled in executives' names had been bought with FTX funds. The commingling of corporate and personal assets was so extensive that determining what belonged to whom was nearly impossible. Ray's team worked to claw back what they could. The Bahamian real estate was seized and eventually sold. Political donations were identified for potential clawback, though many politicians kept the money, arguing they'd received donations in good faith without knowledge of fraud. The venture investments were being liquidated for whatever value could be recovered. In October 2023, nearly a year after the collapse, Sam Bankman-Fried's criminal trial began in Manhattan Federal Court. The trial lasted 5 weeks and featured testimony from Caroline Ellison, Gary Wang, Nishad Singh, and multiple FTX customers who'd lost their life savings. Caroline Ellison's testimony was particularly damning. She described how SBF had directed her to use customer funds from FTX to cover Alameda's losses. She presented internal documents showing the scale of the borrowing, spreadsheets tracking billions in customer funds that Alameda had taken. She broke down crying on the stand when describing the pressure she'd felt and her own guilt about participating in the fraud. Gary Wang testified about the code he'd written at SBF's direction, creating special exemptions for Alameda that allowed them unlimited borrowing without the liquidations other customers would face. He explained that there was no legitimate business reason for this special treatment. It existed solely to allow Alameda to access customer funds. Nishad Singh described the lavish spending, the political donations, the real estate purchases, the executive bonuses, all funded by customer money. He testified that he'd raised concerns with SBF about the use of customer funds, but had been reassured that everything was fine and would be repaid. The customer testimony was heartbreaking. A retiree who'd lost his entire pension, a small business owner whose company failed after FTX froze her operating capital, a young investor who'd put his student loans into FTX, believing SBF's assurances about safety. Their losses were real, specific, and devastating. SBF's defense strategy was to claim ignorance. His lawyers argued he'd been a young CEO managing rapid growth who delegated operations to others. He hadn't committed fraud, he'd been negligent at worst. The losses were due to market conditions and accounting failures, not intentional theft. This defense collapsed under cross-examination. Prosecutors introduced SBF's own signal messages discussing customer fund usage. They showed documents he'd personally signed approving transactions that commingled customer assets. They demonstrated that he'd lied repeatedly in public statements, media interviews, and even in testimony to Congress. Look, the jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. On November 2, 2023, they returned guilty verdicts on all 7 counts of the indictment. Sam Bankman-Fried was convicted of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and related charges. The conviction carried potential sentences totaling over 100 years in prison. While judges typically sentence below the statutory maximum, the scale of the fraud, $8 billion stolen from over 1 million victims, suggested SBF would spend decades incarcerated. On March 28, 2024, Judge Lewis Kaplan sentenced Sam Bankman-Fried to 25 years in federal prison. The sentence was below the prosecution's request for 40 to 50 years, but far above the defense's request for 5 to 6 years. Judge Kaplan specifically rejected SBF's claims that customers would be repaid through bankruptcy proceedings, noting that the losses were real and substantial regardless of potential partial recovery. Judge Kaplan's remarks at sentencing were scathing. He described SBF as someone who knew exactly what he was doing, who lied extensively to cover up his crimes, and who showed no genuine remorse. The judge noted that SBF had obstructed justice by tampering with witnesses and had perjured himself during trial testimony. The effective altruism philosophy that SBF claimed motivated his actions was dismissed as a performing altruism that masked selfish criminality. SBF was ordered to report to federal prison immediately. At 32 years old, he would be approximately 57 when released, assuming good behavior and no reduction in sentence. His entire adult life, from his early 30s through his 50s, would be spent incarcerated. The total collapse was complete. From MIT physics student to Jane Street trader, to crypto billionaire, to federal prisoner in less than a decade. From a $26 billion net worth on paper to negative billions, accounting for the restitution he'd owe victims. From one of the most influential people in cryptocurrency to a cautionary tale about fraud, hubris, and the consequences of stealing billions. The FTX bankruptcy continues. As of 2024, the recovery process has identified several $1 billion in assets that can be returned to customers, though most will receive only a fraction of what they lost. The venture investments SBF made with customer money have proven mostly worthless. The political donations cannot all be clawed back. The luxury real estate has been sold, but only recovered a fraction of what was stolen. For the million-plus victims, the collapse means years of bankruptcy proceedings, partial recoveries at best, and the knowledge that the person who stole their money will spend decades in prison, but they'll never get back what they lost. For the cryptocurrency industry, FTX's collapse was a devastating blow to credibility. It confirmed every skeptic's belief that crypto was riddled with fraud. It validated regulatory concerns about the sector's lack of oversight. It destroyed billions in market value as confidence evaporated. For Sam Bankman-Fried, the collapse meant the complete destruction of everything he'd built. Reputation, freedom, wealth, and the effective altruism legacy he'd claimed to care about. He'd achieved infamy instead of the historical significance he'd sought. The empire built on $8 billion in stolen customer funds had experienced total collapse. And the math genius from MIT, who'd thought he was smarter than everyone else, learned that no amount of intelligence can indefinitely sustain fraud. Eventually, the truth comes out. Eventually, the math stops working. Eventually, everything collapses. So we've seen how Sam Bankman-Fried went from managing a few million in crypto arbitrage trades to building a $32 billion empire, then lost everything in a spectacular collapse that resulted in criminal conviction and 25 years in federal prison. We've traced the path from legitimate trading operations to systematic fraud, from clever marketing to catastrophic implosion. Today, just 2 years after FTX's bankruptcy, the entire episode feels almost surreal. A 30-year-old convinced some of the world's most sophisticated investors to give him billions to run an exchange that was stealing customer funds from day one. He appeared on magazine covers, testified before Congress, and became one of America's largest political donors, all while running one of the biggest frauds in financial history. The scale and audacity are staggering, but when you step back and look at the full picture, FTX wasn't actually that sophisticated. It was a classic fraud, using new customer deposits to cover losses from bad bets, dressed up in cryptocurrency jargon and effective altruism philosophy. The innovation wasn't in the fraud structure, which was as old as banking itself. The innovation was in the marketing, the reputation laundering, the exploitation of regulatory gaps in crypto markets. SBF understood that if you project credibility convincingly enough, people don't look too carefully at the fundamentals. This creates a genuine puzzle about institutional failure. How did Sequoia Capital invest $200+ million after a single Zoom call? How did BlackRock, SoftBank, Temasek, and dozens of other sophisticated funds pour billions into FTX without discovering the fraud? How did regulators in multiple jurisdictions license FTX without detecting that customer funds weren't segregated? The answer is uncomfortable. The due diligence failures were systematic. Investors relied on reputational signals rather than rigorous analysis. They saw that other prestigious firms had invested and assumed that meant FTX was legitimate. They were caught up in FOMO, the fear of missing the next Coinbase or Binance, and rushed to invest before thoroughly examining the business. Regulators in the Bahamas and other jurisdictions where FTX operated provided minimal oversight. They were happy to attract a high-profile crypto company and didn't ask difficult questions about customer fund protection. The light-touch regulation that made the Bahamas attractive to FTX also enabled the fraud to continue undetected for years. The real lesson here isn't just about Sam Bankman-Fried's criminality. It's about how unregulated markets enable fraud on massive scales. In traditional finance, FTX's structure would have been impossible. Regulated exchanges must segregate customer funds. They face regular audits. They maintain capital reserves. They're subject to oversight by agencies like the SEC or CFTC that actually check whether customer assets are protected. FTX operated in the regulatory gaps of cryptocurrency, based in the Bahamas, avoiding US registration, serving international customers who had minimal legal protections. This deregulated environment was celebrated by crypto advocates as freedom from government interference. In practice, it meant freedom to steal $8 billion from customers with no oversight until the fraud collapsed. Whether cryptocurrency markets should be regulated more like traditional finance is a question that divides people. Some argue that regulation would destroy innovation and that customers should accept the risks of unregulated markets. Others argue that basic consumer protections, like requiring exchanges to actually hold the customer assets they claim to custody, are reasonable regardless of the asset class. What's undeniable is that FTX's fraud would have been caught much earlier or prevented entirely in a properly regulated environment. The move fast and break things ethos that crypto imported from Silicon Valley proved catastrophic when applied to managing billions in customer funds. There's also a lesson about the effective altruism movement. SBF's use of EA philosophy to justify wealth accumulation attracted substantial criticism after his conviction. Some EA advocates argued that he'd perverted the movement's principles. Others questioned whether earning to give creates problematic incentives, where ends justify means. The philosophical questions are complex, but the practical lesson is simpler. Moral frameworks that emphasize consequences over rules can rationalize terrible behavior. If you genuinely believe that making billions to donate will save more lives than any harm caused in the process, then corners can be cut, rules can be broken, and fraud can be justified. The math always works out if you value the hypothetical future good more than the concrete present harm. SBF repeatedly claimed he planned to give away his entire fortune. Whether he genuinely believed this, or whether it was purely cynical reputation management, is impossible to know. What's clear is that the effective altruism branding helped attract investors, employees, and customers who trusted him specifically because of his stated philosophical commitments. The paradox is perfect. SBF used a philosophy centered on doing maximum good to perpetrate a fraud that destroyed billions in wealth and harmed over 1 million people. Whatever charitable impact he might have achieved with honestly earned money was overwhelmed by the harm he caused through theft. So the question remains, was Sam Bankman-Fried a brilliant con artist who never believed in effective altruism and used it cynically? Or was he a true believer who convinced himself that the enormous good he could do with billions justified the fraud required to obtain them? The answer probably matters less than the result: $8 billion stolen, millions harmed, and a 25-year prison sentence. The FTX collapse destroyed more than just customer funds. It destroyed trust in cryptocurrency markets, validated skeptics who'd always claimed crypto was riddled with fraud, and made future regulation more likely and more restrictive. The industry SBF claimed to be building was set back years by his criminal conduct. For the million-plus victims, the lessons are bitter. Trust but verify. Reputation isn't proof of legitimacy. Regulatory oversight exists for reasons. And when something seems too good to be true, when an exchange offers high yields with supposedly no risk, when a billionaire claims to be giving it all away, when everyone says an investment is safe, it usually is too good to be true. Sam Bankman-Fried stole $8 billion and almost got away with it. The empire he built looked so legitimate, so successful, so permanent, that nobody looked carefully enough to see it was hollow. But eventually, inevitably, bank runs expose fraud. Market crashes reveal insolvency. And mathematical geniuses learn that no amount of intelligence can indefinitely sustain lies. The math always catches up eventually.